Welcome again. I'm Sarah Judd-Lamb from Carers New South Wales. I'm the Executive Manager of Policy Research and Projects here, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the final session in a series of 8 webinars that we've been delivering this year in association with the Carer Rights and Complaints Network, a working group that we have been working with for a few years, including complaints agencies, peak organisations and rights-based agencies about the rights and complaints available to carers in different settings. So we will give some introductions and an overview shortly, but just a reminder again to anyone that's just joining to please keep your microphone on mute and to turn your video off if you're not a presenter. So before we begin, I would like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're all meeting from today and joining the webinar from. So where I am working from home today, that's the Wallamedigal people, and I wish to extend my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also those from the many lands that I'm sure are represented today. Many of you will be familiar with Carers New South Wales, but just to introduce us, we're the peak non-government organisation for carers in New South Wales. And that's just some points around our focus. So just to clarify, it's always good for us to define carers up front. When we talk about carers today, we're talking about those that are providing support to a family member or friend that has particular care needs. So we're not talking about paid care workers in this instance or the other groups mentioned. But the carers that we're talking about, there's more than 850,000 in New South Wales, and hopefully some of us online today are carers as well. So just to go over the session outline, I mentioned that this is the final session in an 8-part series, and the topic today is a little bit different from some of our previous topics. It's got a lot of different parts to it, and I guess just upfront to say that we received a lot of pre-submitted questions, which is great, and a lot of interest from people registering for the session today. But the fact sheet that is linked to this session, which we will send a link to with the notes and the evaluation form after today's session, covers a lot of ground, a lot of different areas of concern, a lot of different pathways for complaints. So we are not going to cover all of that in detail today. We'll do our best to go in depth in some areas and then just touch on some of the other areas. So if there is a question that doesn't get addressed, please don't hesitate to follow up, and hopefully we'll provide enough information today that you can be pointed in the right direction. But what we're essentially doing today is going through the key parts of that fact sheet, which is a 2-page fact sheet as part of the Know Your Rights series that overviews some common areas that carers may need assistance in relation to financial challenges. And so we will be having a couple of speakers today, and our main external speaker is going to talk about a particular area of financial hardship, and that may be relevant to some people joining us today. And then our second speaker is just going to go over some of the other key areas, and we'll have time for some questions and discussion afterwards. We won't be able to include EWAN's content in the recording. I'm going to pass over now to my colleague Maddie, who's going to just address some of the other bits and pieces on the fact sheet that have come up and hopefully touch on some of the areas that have been raised through the pre-submitted questions. So it'll be a bit of a high-level overview.
Thanks, Sarah. And I am going to keep my video off just because of tech issues, but I just wanted to turn it on and say hello and welcome, and thanks for joining us. So my name's Maddie, and I am part of the Policy and Research team with Carers New South Wales. And before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from where I'm meeting. So that's working from home. They're the Darug people. So I just want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today I'm going to particularly focus on rights and entitlements for carers who are experiencing financial hardship or financial stress. And I want to specifically look at the financial supports that are available to carers, but also highlight some of the complaints options or the complaints pathways if carers are feeling concerned about their financial situation, perhaps the financial situation of the person that they're caring for, or a particular financial service. And we know, and we do hear semi-regularly that many carers can face the financial impacts where they're experiencing increased costs associated with their caring role, and particularly where this is combined with limited capacity to engage in paid employment. And that might be due to the intensity or frequency of their caring role. And in combination, we sometimes see that that can be the perfect storm in creating financial stress and hardship. So we understand that this is particularly stressful, and we feel it's really important that carers are as aware as possible of the supports available to them and those complaints pathways. So I wanted to first focus on getting general help with finances and financial issues, but also looking at the options available to potentially reduce some financial stress. And the first thing I wanted to highlight were the rebates or the financial assistance that's available through Service New South Wales. And I've included all of the service names and the numbers throughout the slides, but don't worry if you miss something, because everything that I say is included in the fact sheet. And we'll send that around with the notes after the webinar. So that financial assistance that's available through Service New South Wales, Narelle's already talked to financial assistance around energy and utilities, but there's also support around things like bushfire assistance, general cost of living expenses, perhaps owning a car and keeping that functioning on the road, using public transport, housing, even recreation and leisure in the community. And so what we recommend to carers is reaching out to Service New South Wales directly, giving them a call, explaining your individual situation and circumstance, and looking at what you may be eligible for through Service New South Wales. If a carer is experiencing financial stress, perhaps they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed or they're feeling confused about a particular financial issue, there is also a service called the National Debt Hotline, and I've included the number there on the slide. And that particular hotline has a range of professional financial counsellors. So they're trained and they can offer free advice or support, particularly in relation to managing debts, but also general information advice. So they can provide that free to you by calling that 1-800 number. If it's legal advice in particular that you're looking for, perhaps in relation to a fine, you've received a road and traffic fine, you don't understand it, or perhaps you disagree with the fine, you can contact a service called Law Access New South Wales, and they provide free legal advice in particular. So that's a good service to keep in mind. So I wanted to focus as well on banking, superannuation, and also insurance. So if you have a particular product, perhaps you have a loan with a particular bank, you might have home and contents insurance, car insurance if you own a car, and of course, superannuation account if you're working. If you have an issue with a product with one of those institutions, we always recommend that it's best to contact the company directly first to discuss that concern. And the reason why we suggest that is sometimes the issue can actually be resolved directly with the company without needing to go and seek further advice or support. And we know that's particularly important for carers because it saves time and it saves energy. If you find that you've had that conversation with the company initially and you are still unable to resolve the issue, or perhaps you disagree with the solution that they've proposed, there is a service that you can contact called the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. We call that AFCA for short, and they can provide mediation and support to resolve the issue. So it's sort of like bringing a third party in to support that communication between yourself and the company and come to an agreed solution that works for everyone involved. There's another company, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's called the Financial Rights Legal Centre Insurance Hotline. And if you're looking for particular advice around an insurance policy specifically, that's a really great company to keep in mind. And I just saw someone noted, can we grab a copy of this? Absolutely, we can include it. So the final thing I wanted to touch on today was around carers who are supporting somebody else with their finances. And we know that some carers do support another person to manage their finances, This might be informal support, or it could be formal if they're legally appointed to manage or support with finances. We know that this isn't uncommon where the person being cared for maybe experiences difficulty in understanding their finances, or perhaps in making specific decisions in relation to their finances. And we often hear and really appreciate that this can be very complex. It can be difficult, it can be stressful, and it can be confusing for carers. So I just wanted to highlight some particular supports for carers who are providing support to somebody else to manage their finances, or perhaps the person they care for is likely to need that in the future. The first service is New South Wales Trustee and Guardian, and they're particularly good for providing information ahead of time. So if you're caring for somebody and you know that due to their illness or their disability, they're likely to experience deterioration, particularly around their mental capacity, it's a really great option to together, if possible, contact New South Wales Trustee and Guardian and have that conversation early. Have it together, involve everybody, and seek that information ahead of time. They also provide information if you're already providing that support, but I think we always recommend to try and get that advice early if you can. The second service, if you're needing information about legal requirements or your rights and responsibilities when supporting someone with finances, you can contact Law Access New South Wales. And I mentioned them before a little bit earlier in my slides. They provide free legal advice and information, including in relation to providing this sort of support. So just to finish up, all of the information that I've talked to you today is contained in the fact sheet that we've developed. All of the names of the specific services, all of the numbers. So if you've missed anything, don't worry, we'll share that as well. And that's also available on our website on our Carer Resources page. And I'll hand back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Maddie. So I'm going to just speak to a few more of the detailed areas covered in the pre-submitted questions. Just noting we have had a bit of interaction in the chat. So we got a question about the slides. So definitely the Carers New South Wales slides we're happy to share, and they'll be included in the published recording. We won't be able to include EWAN's content in the recording. So just clarifying with Narelle whether those slides are shareable, but either way, we'll make sure we are able to send through the information that's covered. The second question was around whether the New South Wales Trustee and Guardian can help with setting up a disability trust or wills. So I had said in there that they would be a good first contact. I think there might be some other places sort of to contact about that, but it would be definitely worth phoning them and having a chat around those areas first. Great, so we'll send you an email with the key information that's been provided today following the session. So did anyone have any questions and answers as yet for what Maddie's just covered before we go into some additional pre-submitted questions? Okay, fantastic. So what we wanted to do now, we had probably, I think actually the most pre-submitted questions for any of these webinars today, and the most range as well, and quite a few that are technically kind of beyond what we would be able to answer or necessarily cover today, but we've tried to incorporate as many of the broad topics as possible in what Maddie's just presented. So hopefully some of you that have put in pre-submitted questions will have already been able to see from those slides, yes, maybe that's what I'm looking for. So I guess I just wanted to go over very briefly those questions and provide again some key contacts. So some of these Maddie will have already spoken to in more detail, but this slide and the next slide really have touch on the key points we would recommend for each of those pre-submitted questions. I won't go through them all in detail, but I guess just touching on some key ones. So we mentioned, Maddie mentioned the National Debt Hotline and some of the areas in which that might be a relevant referral point. We had an example, I think, come through there, which was around issues with people losing money for that reason, I think around Centrelink debts and having financial hardship as a result of that. So For things around debts, like Maddie said, National Debt Helpline is a really good point to go to, and any kind of crisis type hardship associated with money, that would be a good place to start. The other thing that I mentioned before around, if it's around income support and Centrelink, the first place to start there is usually Services Australia, which is sort of in charge of the admin side of Centrelink. So on that slide there, you have Services Australia, and that's the carer and disability line there. So if you've got particular queries about what's available or what your entitlements are, what the complaints processes are, that's the best place to start. And also, if there's real issues and you've been trying to resolve an issue with Centrelink that you've not been able to get an answer, we would also recommend the Welfare Rights Centre, which is just under there as well. The Welfare Rights Centre was involved in the webinar number 6 that we did, which I mentioned earlier, on Centrelink specifically. So there's a whole webinar with very detailed information that is available in a recording format that people can look at if they've got specific questions around Centrelink. So law access is another really good starting point just for free general legal advice around financial questions. So some of the questions that came through that may be best to go to them about, just because we can't provide legal advice relating to finances, they might be able to point you in the right direction for questions around legal appointments and sort of directions to go in for wills in that sense. And I think we had a question around liability for funeral costs and that kind of thing. I think for general legal type questions, maybe that's a good starting point. They'll be able to suggest some other places to go. We also put Seniors' Rights Service there because we had some questions come through around a number of issues that would be relevant there, particularly to do with paying for aged care services. So you will see in our series of fact sheets, we have a fact sheet on aged care services and we have a fact sheet on disability services. And they also have webinars attached to them, which go into more detail about some of the issues that might arise. So depending on what the issue is, it's probably best to look at those first. But Seniors' Rights Service is a really great service for ageing Australians and their carers, and they're really helpful in pointing you in the right direction as well, and in providing individual advocacy where needed, and assistance accessing aged care services. The Trustee and Guardian, which Maddie spoke about, is a really good place to start. Their information service is a really good place to start for questions around representing someone, those kinds of processes and appointments. We had a couple of questions that associated with that, just having a look. So looking at official documentation in place for a young person and how to set that up, that would be a good starting point, or to have a look at their website as well. Similarly, long-term unwell people and just looking to act on their behalf in different areas where it's maybe not so straightforward around powers of attorney and things like that. We do have some information on our website about the key decision-making appointments, but once again, that's not our expertise. So we'd really encourage questions around powers of attorney, guardianship, supported decision-making to go to the Trustee and Guardian website. We also, and Maddie's just put the link up in the chat there for where the fact sheets I'm referring to are. So the fact sheet for today's session, the fact sheet on aged care services, disability services, and also Centrelink are all on that web link that Maddie has provided. And Narelle's just added the E1 link as well there. So in terms of other places to go, so I mentioned Services Australia and Welfare Rights Centre. I think some of the questions that were around that, let me just have a look on my list here. Yeah, we had some technical questions around what people are and are not entitled to around financial support who are on carer payments. So again, that would be a Services Australia or Welfare Rights Centre question. And similarly, looking at future planning with fees and charges around Centrelink trust accounts, anything Centrelink, best to go to Services Australia and Welfare Rights Centre. Same for hardship funerals is probably a Services Australia question. Something came through on that. So there's some key starting points, and we will send this around. If we can go to the next slide, Grace. Here is just some other sort of key points. So Service New South Wales is, Maddie had mentioned before, there's a range of financial information on rebates and other services that can be found through Service New South Wales. The reason I'm including it here is actually in relation to a question that we had that related to the COVID scenario and around hospital. So it's sort of a little bit different to the finances issue, but we did have a question come through around how can you get sort of power of attorney type documentation signed when someone's in hospital and visitors aren't allowed. We're getting a lot of questions around COVID and especially visitor access issues, those kinds of things. That is probably something that is a little more complex. And so we're really encouraging, there's a Service New South Wales has a 24/7 phone number, which is up there at the moment, where people can call with queries about the public health order, about COVID restrictions, and they can then from there refer to other teams, including New South Wales Health. So we'd encourage you to access that service to just see if they can provide an answer. But the other thing to note in the context especially of COVID, if there's major problems and barriers resulting from COVID or other policy issues, you're very welcome to contact the Carers New South Wales policy team, which is where Grace and Maddie and I are based at Carers New South Wales. And so that our contact details at the bottom of this present slide. If there's a particular scenario that you think is going to be affecting other carers that seems like a bit of a roadblock, that's the kind of thing that we're happy to take a case study on and investigate and see whether there's any way we can raise awareness of that with government and seek change. The other ones that I've got up there, so we had a number of quite specific questions around, I guess, advice to do with how to save money to earn some interest, whether to take super out, whether to plan ahead for buying funerals. So it's definitely not something that I'm qualified to answer, or anyone in my answer. And I guess there's different directions you could take with that, financial planner or something like that. But we recommend point of call that you have a look at Financial Counsellors Association of New South Wales. It's just the same phone number as the debt helpline before, but it just can be a good place for people to start that maybe are working with limited finances and want to find where to get some advice about those kinds of decisions. So I think, yeah, that's something that we would probably point you to there, and then hopefully they can point you in the right direction. And then finally, there was a question around whether there's sources of funding for sort of one-off purchases, like getting a laptop or something like that. So the other one that I've put there is Carer Gateway. Carer Gateway is the new national support system for carers across Australia. Carers New South Wales is one of the providers in New South Wales, but that system, one of the supports that's available is some one-off and ongoing packages that can purchase specific items to support your caring role, also education and employment. So Carer Gateway has different providers in different parts of New South Wales, but if you phone that number, you'll get your local provider. And if that's something that you need, a bit of a financial assistance for a particular purpose, definitely that's something you can explore with them, and it may be within the scope of what they can provide. So I think that more or less covers the main questions that came through pre-submitted. Hopefully at least anyone that's asked a question sort of has a key place to maybe go to follow that up. Were there any questions that I haven't covered or that others wanted to add from this discussion, either to the chat or to take your mic off? So I guess feel free to keep sort of thinking about questions, but something that's really, I guess, important to highlight in relation to where this webinar is coming from. Number one, a reminder again that all of the information in today's webinar you can access through the fact sheet that's associated with this webinar. And maybe Maddie, would you mind just posting that link again? I'll show you that fact sheet as well in a sec. Maybe Grace, if you want to go to the next slide, is it? Oh, next one. Yep. That's the link to where the fact sheets are, and there's also a link on that page to the recorded sessions. But the Carer Rights and Complaints Network that developed these resources is part of the New South Wales Carers Strategy, which is an overarching whole of government strategy in New South Wales that looks at a whole range of improving supports for carers. So this project is something that the government's behind in trying to raise carers' awareness of their rights in different settings and service systems, and to encourage them to take advantage of the complaints processes that are available. So one of the key reasons we want to have these webinars is to show you kind of a face of different agencies that are there to provide information and support, and just to give you a sense that in a lot of situations that might be challenging, there are actually pathways that you can try and get a solution. It's not always easy, but a lot of the agencies we work with are really committed to providing good customer service, to helping to point you in the right direction. So we really want to encourage that. And Maddie's just popped that in the chat as well, where the direct link for that is. Also, the other project associated with the New South Wales Carers Strategy that Carers New South Wales is working on in the near future is on the kind of content that Maddie was speaking about before. We are looking more in a more focused way at carers' financial hardship and carers' financial experiences, and trying really to develop some more plans and resources to help carers with the range of financial issues that they have. So that's something that we're working on more intently, and hopefully within the next 12 months there'll be some more detailed advice coming out in this area, because we know it's a real pressure area for a lot of people, especially during COVID. So that's just a little bit about the project and its context. I guess we can probably then sort of head towards wrapping up. Any last questions, any last comments that anyone wanted to? Oh, here's one. Great. So just having a look at that question. So I guess the question here is more than one carer eligible to access financial assistance or support where there's one person being cared for? It would depend, I guess, on the kind of financial support you're talking about. So there'd be specific rules around Centrelink financial support, which again would be best to go through Services Australia to inquire about that around eligibility criteria. In other situations, whether it's the Service New South Wales supports or other areas, I think it would need to be a question that is addressed in those individual contexts. And I guess something to recognise here as well is that one thing that is pretty common in accessing any kind of support or entitlement as a carer is there tends to be assumptions that there's one primary carer, and in many cases that is true, but in many cases that's not the case. There's multiple people that are involved in caring for someone, and that can be a barrier in accessing support and entitlement sometimes. So as a general rule, that's often the structure for eligibility. But if that's something that you come across and that's a real problem for your household or the person you're caring for, that's the kind of thing that our policy team, it's worth us knowing about, so we can kind of look at whether that's a system problem that's affecting other people, because we understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. So it's a good question.
I was just going to add, in acknowledgement of the fact that we've had a few inquiries this year around from carers who have been concerned around risk of financial abuse for the person that they're caring for. So I was just going to highlight that there is support available if you're feeling concerned about possible risk of financial abuse. There's a government agency, they're independent, they're called the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commission. And their role is to protect older people, but also adults living with disability from abuse, neglect and exploitation. So they have a helpline called the Ageing and Disability Abuse Helpline, and they are available Monday to Friday for information and support on that line if you've got those concerns.
Thanks, Maddie. And yeah, so again, we've covered a lot of ground today, a lot of topics, a lot of contact points. Hopefully people that are participating will be able to pick out what bits are related to their situation and questions. But just a reminder again, the main purpose of these is to just give you a sense of what is out there, and to really encourage you to pursue assistance if you've got an issue. But all of the key contact points are in the fact sheet associated with this webinar, and we'll send you around how to access that, as well as that link in the chat. And really the aim of those fact sheets and this webinar has been to try and, I guess, identify the key contact points, where to start, organisations that we know will help and do their best to point you in the right direction. So I'm sure you'll probably heads are spinning with information, but please do just refer to those resources in future if you need to follow anything up. Thank you everyone for joining us, and you can expect an email, follow-up email soon from us with some further information and evaluation questionnaire as well. And thank you for participating in the 8-part series. It's been an 8-month journey to deliver these, and we've been really glad to have interest, and they'll all be available for people to share and use later on. So thanks everybody, and take care.
Thanks everyone.